Senate Ag Committee advanced a bill last week that would create a voluntary GMO labeling system across the country. If passed, the legislation would prevent a state-by-state arrangement, including Vermont's mandatory labeling law set to take place in July. However, a separately pushed proposal in the Senate would require mandatory GMO labeling. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben about these efforts.
It's really coming to a head with the mandatory labeling in Vermont set to take effect this summer. Suddenly Congress has the impetus and the momentum to put something together on GM food labeling. Right now we have seen something that's moved through the House previously, and we're looking at Senate action. The Senate Agriculture Committee did forward a bill out of committee that would preempt the Vermont legislation and any other state legislation with a voluntary labeling guideline at the national level. There is, however, some realization that there's likely to be some compromise or alternatives considered here as it reaches the floor. One of those could push all the way to a mandatory national label that preempts state-by-state labeling. One of them could simply be some amendments to the voluntary labeling that says, here's a voluntary labeling guideline with benchmarks for disclosure, and if those benchmarks aren't met, voluntary might eventually become mandatory anyway.
Can you explain the concerns they have about a state-by-state labeling system?
Well, clearly it's very difficult to imagine a marketing structure in the food marketing system if you have 15, 20, 30 different labeling requirements as to what's required to be disclosed or how it's required to be labeled. There's a reason we have the Interstate Commerce Clause, and that's to facilitate trade between states and business commerce across the country without those sort of complicated state-by-state regulations and rules that hinder trade. Take another example, organic. And while organic itself is one way to try and identify something that currently has no GM in it, but the organic label was a confusing label and a complicated sort of marketing structure for many, many years before the Fed stepped in, before USDA was tasked with defining an organic label. So there's a reason and a rationale for perhaps a federal guideline or a federal preemption on what local labeling might look like.
There were senators that supported this out of committee talking about the voluntary initiative, but say they want amendments when it comes to the full floor, otherwise they won't support it. So how do you think this battle is going to go between the voluntary and mandatory if we see them both?
Well, we've seen the voluntary legislation proceed from committee. We've had, have seen discussion of a mandatory proposal coming to the floor directly. But we also have the likely discussion that says the voluntary label legislation moves forward, but it only garners support to get across the finish line if we pay attention to some of the discussion about potential compromise. And that compromise is in the form of perhaps benchmarks. Benchmarks on if companies aren't voluntarily disclosing this information in a timely fashion, in an accessible way, and some debate about the right approach there. Something on the label or a reference on the label to go to the website, those kinds of differences. But imagine a voluntary guideline that has benchmarks that says if the industry can achieve this, voluntary works. If the industry fails on this, you may see much more pressure for a mandatory rule down the road.
What role does cost play in this?
Well, cost is an interesting question here because it's at multiple levels. The cost of the label itself is virtually insignificant. The cost of the segregation that goes into fulfilling the product behind the label is pretty substantial. Are you labeling the GM technology produced food products where you're adding sort of a label and maybe a supply chain management system for everything you do under a mandatory regime, for example? Or are you labeling the non-GM side of this under a voluntary regime? The consumer groups, the interest groups that are pushing for mandatory labeling are predominantly in the non-GM camp. We want the non-GM product. Well, a voluntary market system that allows you to label the non-GM product and to pay for the segregation and to pay for the labeling and to pay for the supply chain management in that system passes the cost on to the consumers that are interested in paying for it. It's the interest from the non-GM side that says we want the GM side to label that pushes the cost onto the rest of the food system.
As far as labeling action in the Senate, we'll update you when lawmakers act on any legislation.